So I'm just gonna like, oh, by the way, I'm IFIS, I run the Rogue Feminist. I'm just gonna do this as a practice run, so I'm not probably gonna show anybody this. But basically, I guess I can talk about really quickly. I identify as bisexual and genderqueer, gender fluid. And I was just gonna talk about a few things because I tend to talk too much, so I can't really pick one question. But I have like a few questions from your thingy that I have here. One thing I've been like really thinking about a lot lately is the use of the term queerbaiting, and I have some issues with it, and I think that the Tumblr sphere tends to use this word a little bit broadly and kind of inaccurately. That would be my argument. I think that there's some wrongful notions about what a sexual orientation is and what it means in terms of fiction. Because when we talk about sexual orientation, one thing that you have to remember is that it's constructed. Sexual orientation is a cultural, social construction that is not ahistorical. And what you also have to understand is that when somebody identifies in a certain way, they have chosen a label that they feel most accurately communicates their experiences. So for example, you could have a man who is attracted mostly to men, like almost all of his feelings, sexual and romantic feelings, have been toward men in his life. But he's had a few experiences where he's felt attracted to women. Maybe he even had a relationship with a woman and he did feel attraction to her to some degree, but it wasn't the same as anything he felt toward men, and maybe he feels like he'll probably never experience that again. So he could identify as gay. However, you might have a man with really similar experiences who identifies as bi. And that's a personal kind of decision because these labels aren't very precise. Like, I knew a gay guy who had a relationship with a butch woman. Butch lesbian, actually, I think. And he still identifies as gay, and that makes sense. These things aren't set in stone. I've known straight people who've been in relationships with people of the same gender. So you have to understand that, like, sexual orientation is not, like, set in stone or imprinted in your DNA, even though there's a lot of people who want you to think that. And because of that, you can't really know what a character's sexual orientation is unless they state it, or they make it very clear, or, like, for example, I'm not attracted to women at all, I'm only attracted to men, or something like that. But you still can't, it's hard to say, because a character's not even a person. It's not a person. It's more complicated than I think people like to say. I mean, there are characters who do identify as gay, and they say so in the story, or whatever. And I'm not saying we can't critique homophobic portrayals of characters, or we can't critique the lack of representation of characters. We definitely, of gay, queer people, we definitely can. And I'm not saying we can't. And I think that the lack of representation is a huge problem. But the reason I'm talking about this is because sexual orientation is a construct, and sometimes I don't think that construct makes sense. For one thing, it doesn't apply to all cultures, and it doesn't apply to all metaphysical realities of different art worlds either. I'm sorry I said that, but like metaphysics is sort of like the way a reality works. Like, what is it made up of? What makes sense in the world? And the art world, like every artwork has its own metaphysics. I'm kind of getting to art, philosophy of art right now. So, in my view, and not everyone is going to agree with me on this, but in my view, sexual orientation does not apply to every metaphysical reality. I mean, it doesn't even apply to every social reality or society. So, it's weird when you start talking about it. I mean, I think we could still have queer interpretations and still have an interpretation like this character is gay. And sometimes they are really probably gay. Like, because when people mostly assume that characters are straight, and that assumption is often, or can be wrong. And I'm not saying that, and I don't want people to hear my argument and say, like, well, then there's no gay characters. Like, no, that's bullshit, and you're stupid. My point isn't that. My point is more that when you talk about sexual orientation, it's more complex, and the discussion is actually more complex. Because when we talk about queer baiting, this is the other thing I want to talk about. I think a lot of times people use this word for things that actually aren't queer baiting. Because I kind of want to talk about, there's kind of three different things when it comes to implied homoerotic relations or interactions between two characters, or feelings between two characters. There's queer baiting, which I think is rarer than a lot of people are saying, there's queer baiting, there's queer subtext, and there's, I guess I would call it, like, implied queer relationship where it's basically, it is, and if they were straight, everyone would know. You know, if it was an opposite gender relationship, everyone would accept it, but it's not stated, but it's implied to the point where, okay. And those are kind of like the three, oh, actually, and last one, homoerotic undertones between two people in a homosocial relationship. So, I should have, like, written this down. I'm going to redo this. So, basically, when you have those things, the first thing I'm going to talk about is, okay, so with what I just said, what is homosocial? Homosocial, it just means any kind of relationship between two people of the same gender. It's usually not gay. Like, usually the point is they're, like, friends, but there's, like, there's homoerotic components. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but where you have, like, a really intense relationship with someone, maybe they're even the opposite gender, but there can be erotic components to it, but you might not ever date them, you might not ever fuck them or anything, but there's that element to it because of the intensity of your relationship. So I think this happens, and sometimes when people see this, they label it as queer baiting, which I think is unfair. I think that, for example, Sherlock, I think, is a show where they actually is labeled as having queer baiting, BBC's Sherlock, and I would disagree. I think that actually the relationship is extremely intense and erotically charged, and you could read it as gay, but it's meant to be that way. Like, I think that you can see the thematics with Irene Adler, for example. Like, she's identifies as lesbian, and yet she falls in love with Sherlock, and I would argue, and she says this, basically, she says they're a couple, that John is straight and is in love with Sherlock. That's my interpretation. You could interpret it differently. But my point is that it thematically ties into the series, the intensity of the relationship, and it's not just there for, like, fandom crap. Like, it's there as thematically integral. And then you have, like, subtext, where it's, like, the author probably wanted you to think, oh, they probably are gay, and there's subtextual elements there, but it's not, you know, very obvious. And then you have what I was talking about, like, my example would be, Kaworu and Shinji, I don't know if that's, yes, Kaworu and Shinji, where it's, like, in Evangelion, the anime. They are fucking queer. I don't care what anyone says. Like, it's implied to the point where if they were opposite gender, no one would argue this. They would never argue with it. And it's not even queer, it's not subtext, it's not queer baiting, it is that they are queer. Like, you can see that the relationship is there's flirtation, there's erotic innuendo, there's, Kaworu comes on to Shinji erotically responds to Kaworu's come on, so it's very much, it's there. I would say it's canon, it's just not explicit to the point of hitting you over the head with it. So there's that, and then you have, queer baiting, and queer baiting I think is more when you have things hinted at between characters of the same gender for titillating the audience. And that's all. That's its purpose. Like, my friend was telling me how with Teen Wolf, the actors will actually, like, post tweets, like, oh, guess prepare yourselves for the gayness in this episode, and then he just touches him on the shoulder or some bullshit. That is queer baiting. Like, if they're actually, like, another example I could think of, even though I love Toward the Terra, like, in Toward the Terra, there's stuff with Blue, Soldier Blue, this is an anime, and Jomi, where they, like, get really, really close, like they're gonna kiss, and then it just doesn't happen, and they just go apart. That's queer baiting. Like, it's like you're literally teasing people. Like, you're literally like, ooh, look at this, ooh, look at this, and then you don't do anything. But there's a difference between that and, like, homoerotic elements to a relationship. Or, like, Death Note is another example. I'm doing all this anime stuff. But, like, with Light and L, like, they have an erotically charged relationship, but it thematically ties in. It's not like, ooh, look at this. It's like, no, like, look at the intensity of this. They're obsessed with each other. Like, they don't have the, like, Light especially doesn't have the capacity to form any kind of relationship with anybody except what he has with L. Like, that's the point. And that's a big integral part of this series and what else Light's doing and stuff. That was so articulate. But, so my point is there's these different ways that queerness kind of forms or it informs texts. And when I say texts, I also include movies and everything else. And people tend to say queer baiting for all of it. But what they actually mean, I can't speak for everybody, but what I think what they're expressing is a frustration with the lack of explicit, romantic, sexual, same-gender relationships, okay? Like, the thing is, like, straight people will get these kinds of relationships I'm talking about between men and women, and they'll get the really explicit, really obvious kissing, and we're romantic, we're a couple. They get all of it, but we tend to just get that subtextual stuff I just talked about. That's most of what we get. So the problem isn't the subtext. Like, subtext is fine. Like, it's great. There's a lot of richness there. Like, there's a lot of richness in a complex relationship where you can't put a label on it, really. There's a lot of richness in, like, what was I just gonna say? I lost it. But a lot of the other things I talked about, that's not the problem, except for queer baiting. Queer baiting is always bad. But all those other things I talked about are good and rich. The problem is we don't have enough of the explicit things. That's the problem. We don't have enough characters who are just, like, gay and then deal with being gay. Like, we have some of it, but it's always like, oh, I came out and then tragedy, whatever. But we don't have enough of, like, that kind of stuff. So that's the problem. Like, that subtext, the homoerotic, homosocial interactions, the, like, those things are actually really rich and interesting. The problem is, so it's not that those things are bad, it's that we don't have, that's all we have is the problem. Like, that's mostly all we have. That's, like, I think, that's what I have to say about queer baiting, is that queer baiting is only when there's, like, a quite obvious concerted effort to titillate the audience through teasing glances and things like that, and it's really obvious. Like, it's not just erotic elements or subtextual things, but it's like what I was just saying before. And the problem isn't the subtext, the problem is, like I just said, there's not enough text for us. It's all subtext, or mostly. That's, like, my opinion on it. I wanted to talk about other stuff, but I ran out of time, so